This is one of the darkest and most forgotten chapters in the history of America, and almost nobody talks about it. In 1719, over 1,700 prisoners were taken from Paris and shipped to Louisiana, not as settlers, not as pioneers, but as experiments. And what happened to them is something history almost erased. Imagine this. You're rotting in a prison cell in Paris. The walls are wet. The air smells like death. You haven't eaten in 2 days. You don't know if you'll make it to morning. Then someone opens the door, and they offer you a deal. Freedom. But here's what they don't tell you yet. Some of these prisoners were forced into marriages before they even left the building. Some women didn't even know they were leaving France. Some ships lost half their passengers before they ever saw land. And what waited for them in Louisiana was worse than the prison they left behind. This was the deal. Freedom. For exile. And for over 1,700 people, they never got the chance to say no. This is the true story history doesn't teach, and we're just getting started. Reintis. To understand what really happened, you need to understand what Paris looked like in 1719, because it wasn't the city of lights. It was a city rotting from the inside. The streets were packed with desperate people. Beggars lined every corner. Children slept in doorways. The smell of sewage and decay hung over entire neighborhoods like a permanent fog. France had just survived decades of brutal war. And it had lost, not on the battlefield, but financially. King Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, he had spent the country into the ground. By the time he died in 1715, France was buried in debt, staggering, catastrophic, generational debt. The treasury was empty, and the people, they were the ones paying for it. The gap between rich and poor in Paris wasn't just wide, it was violent. The nobility ate behind locked gates on silver plates. Everyone else starved in the gutters. And when people starve, they do what they have to do. Crime exploded. Theft, prostitution, black market trading, vagrancy. People were arrested for crimes as simple as having no fixed address, for begging in the wrong street, for being outside after dark. The prisons of Paris became something worse than prisons. They became warehouses. The Salpêtrière, a massive complex on the edge of the city, and originally built as a gunpowder factory, had been converted into a detention centre for women, thieves, prostitutes, the mentally ill, the homeless, women who had committed no real crime at all, except being poor and female and visible. The Bicêtre prison on the southern outskirts was worse. Men packed into cells built for half their number. Typhus, dysentery, scurvy. Men who died not from punishment, but from neglect. Their bodies sometimes undiscovered for hours, sometimes longer. These were the forgotten prisoners of Paris. No rehabilitation, no plan, no future, just containment. But someone was about to remember them, and not out of mercy. Enter John Law. Remember this name? John Law was Scottish, born in Edinburgh in 1671. Brilliant, magnetic. I utterly convinced he had discovered how money actually worked. He had already fled Britain after killing a man in a duel. He wandered Europe. He gambled. He theorized. He schemed. And then he arrived in France, at exactly the wrong moment in history. Or the right one. Depending on who you were. The French regent was desperate. France needed money. France needed a miracle. And John Law walked in with a plan so bold, it seemed almost impossible. He would create a national bank, issue paper money, back it not with gold, but with confidence. And then he went further. He created the Mississippi Company, a trading monopoly over France's territory in North America. A vast, barely explored wilderness, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico, north along the Mississippi River. Louisiana, on paper. Mohammed was extraordinary. Law described Louisiana the way a con man describes a dream. Endless fertile land, Rivers full of fish, natural resources beyond counting, cities waiting to be built, fortunes waiting to be claimed. He printed pamphlets. He commissioned paintings. He stood in rooms full of powerful men and made them believe. Come to Louisiana, the propaganda said. Build a new life. Grow rich. Start over. The problem? Almost none of it was true. Louisiana in 1719 was swamp. Mosquito-infested, fever-ridden, brutally hot swamp. But that was a problem for later. Right now, law needed one thing above everything else: bodies. Warm bodies to plant on that soil, to make investors believe the colony was real, growing, alive. Voluntary settlers were not coming fast enough. And the real reports had already leaked. People knew Louisiana was not paradise, so someone made a decision that would destroy more than 1,000 lives. They turned to the prisons. The logic was cold and clean. These prisoners cost money. They produced nothing. They were a problem. What if they became a solution? Royal agents walked into the Bicêtre, into the Salpêtrière. They compiled names, they made offers: sign here, walk free. This was the deal: a cell in Paris, for a life in Louisiana. For some, it genuinely felt like a choice. Anything was better than dying in that cell. But for many others, there was no choice at all. Documented accounts confirmed that prisoners were physically dragged from their cells. People were swept off the streets of Paris. Boys who had never been convicted of anything. Women were told they were being released, walked out into daylight for the first time in months, and found themselves being marched toward the docks. And here is one of the most shocking facts of this entire story. Some prisoners were arrested specifically to fill quotas. The City Watch was given numbers to hit. Deliver this many bodies by this date. And when the prisons ran dry, they went into the streets, into the markets, into the alleyways. People vanished from Paris, and nobody powerful enough to ask questions was asking. And then came the detail that makes this story almost impossible to believe. The authorities decided these prisoners would be more manageable if they arrived in Louisiana as couples. So they forced them into marriages, on the spot, before departure. A stranger pushed to your side, a paper placed in your hands, a signature demanded. You've been in a cell for months. You don't know what day it is. You don't know this person next to you. And someone in a uniform tells you, sign, you're married. You leave in 3 days. This was the deal. Some couples had never exchanged a single word before the ceremony. Some refused and were threatened. Some wept, without making any sound at all. The ships left from the Atlantic ports: Lorient, Rochefort, La Rochelle. Pause for a second and imagine standing on that dock. You have never seen the ocean. You've spent months in a dark cell. Your legs are weak. The light hurts your eyes. Your clothes are rags. You are holding the hand of someone you met 3 days ago, and in front of you, Oz is the Atlantic Ocean, and you have to cross it. The ships were not passenger vessels. They were cargo ships, converted for human transport, cramped, dark, reeking of tar and bilge water, and fear. The crossing took 6 to 12 weeks. 6 to 12 weeks, in spaces too small to stand upright, on food barely enough to survive, moving through water that never stopped moving. Disease came fast, typhus first, carried by lice, on a ship packed with people who hadn't washed in months. Lice were everywhere. The fever hit, then the rash, then delirium, then silence. Dysentery swept through passengers like a wave. People wasted away in days. And here is a moment that should stop you cold. Some ships lost half their passengers before they ever saw land. Not a few unlucky souls. Half. People died in the dark below deck and were thrown into the ocean. No ceremony, no record, no one to remember their names. Just gone. And the ones who survived arrived at the mouth of the Mississippi River, exhausted, sick, grieving, terrified, and found nothing like what was promised. This is what the real history of Louisiana looks like up close. This is the part history tried to erase, because what waited for these people was not freedom. It was a different kind of prison, one without walls. Louisiana in 1719 was wilderness, true, unbroken, relentless wilderness. The heat was not warmth, it was weight, a suffocating, pressing, inescapable weight from the moment the sun rose. The air was so thick with moisture, it felt like breathing through wet cloth. And the mosquitoes, swarms so dense at dusk they could darken the sky, biting through fabric, covering every inch of exposed skin within seconds, carrying something nobody had a name for yet, what we now call malaria, what they called the fever. New Orleans had only been founded the year before, 1 year old when these prisoners arrived. It was not a city. It was a scattering of wooden structures slowly sinking into swamp, roads that dissolved into mud after rain, buildings rotting from the humidity before they were even finished. And these people were supposed to clear it, farm it, build on it. Most of them had never held a plough in their lives. They were pickpockets, prostitutes, debtors, beggars, city people, dropped into a primal landscape with almost no tools, almost no food, and almost no help. Supply ships from France arrived irregularly. Sometimes months passed between deliveries. People ate what they could find, wild game, roots, whatever the forest offered to people who didn't know how to read a forest. And here is a documented fact that is almost unbearable. There are accounts of colonists dying of starvation within sight of a river full of fish, because nobody taught them how to survive here. This was the deal. Freedom for this. And through all of it, there was no way home, none. No savings to purchase passage, no company offering returns, no official mechanism of any kind. You were in Louisiana. This was your life now. Some people walked into the wilderness and simply never came back. No record of death, no record of survival, just absence. But back in Paris, John Law's empire had become something nobody had seen before, a financial frenzy. Shares in the Mississippi Company were exploding in value. Ordinary people poured everything they had into the stock. The streets around Law's offices were so crowded, people were literally trampled. The word millionaire was coined during this period. That is real history. That word did not exist before the Mississippi bubble. It was invented to describe people getting rich off a company built on lies, about a swamp full of dying prisoners. But none of that mattered to the people already on the ships, because while Paris was getting rich, they were dying. And then the honest reports started coming back from Louisiana. Not the pamphlets, the real ones, written by survivors, by soldiers, and by priests who had watched people die. There was no gold, no silver, no endless farmland. There was fever and starvation and mud and death. Investors began to sell, and when one sells, others follow. The cascade began in early 1720. By summer, the Mississippi bubble had collapsed. Share prices fell to almost nothing. The paper money Law had printed became worthless in weeks. People who had been millionaires in January were bankrupt by September. Riots broke out in Paris. Families were destroyed overnight. Suicides followed financial ruin, with terrible regularity. And John Law, the architect of all of it, the man who had set this entire machine in motion, fled France in the night. He died in Venice in 1729, alone, largely forgotten, relatively poor. But the company that had ripped people from prison cells and shipped them across an ocean simply ceased to exist. And the people in Louisiana abandoned. No announcement, no rescue ships, no acknowledgement that any of this had ever happened. Just silence. History moved on. And here is the part no one tells you. Some of those prisoners survived. They built lives. They had children. They planted roots in soil that had nearly killed them. And today, there are people in Louisiana walking around who are descended from prisoners, once dragged out of Paris in chains. People eating food shaped by that culture, listening to music born from that suffering, living in cities built on foundations they cannot see. Those prisoners were never supposed to matter. They were problems to be solved, and bodies to be counted, and moved, and forgotten. But they became the foundation of something bigger than anyone who sent them there ever imagined. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all, because history doesn't only remember the powerful. Sometimes it is built on the people they tried to erase. This is the hidden history of Louisiana. This is the dark history of America that doesn't make it into the textbooks. This is the true story of over 1,700 forgotten people who were given the worst deal in history, and somehow, some of them found a way to survive it. If this story stayed with you, share it, because the people in this story couldn't speak for themselves, but we can speak for them now. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling the stories history tried to forget. And it all started with a simple offer: freedom for exile.